Hello there, good morning everybody. So today we're going to go ahead and hello Renee, good morning. So today we're going to be kind of finishing up World War One with the essential facts that you need to know, and then talking a little bit about how World War One comes to a conclusion, and then as per usual, there'd be some sort of assignment that goes along with it. And we're winding down here, and then for the rest of the school year, I think we'll just spend a day talking about kind of World War Two. Really, before we get to World War II, we have to talk about the interwar years, and we'll talk about World War II, we'll talk about the Cold War a little bit, and that'll bring us pretty much right up to the end of the school year. So, World War I. Let's pull up the PowerPoint here. So, last time we were talking about kind of the war itself. We talked a bit about the Schlieffen Plan, and we talked about some of the psychological warfare and physical, wounds that people come out with, and the effect long term that had on them, and kind of medical advancements and things like that. Today we're going to be focusing more on like other aspects of the war that might not seem totally apparent right away. And of course, I don't have the time or ability to go into as much depth as I typically would have if we were going to school on a regular basis, but we'll do what we can. And I also talked about some of the new technologies and things. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that if you consider our current times and kind of the bizarro land that we're all living in right now. World War I also was accompanied by a significant pandemic of the Spanish flu. And, the thing about those times, of course, is that medical knowledge was nowhere near what it is today. So they didn't have the metrics, the data systems, and other things like that to be able to keep such close tabs on the spread of a disease. Now, they call it the Spanish flu, but it did not originate in Spain, though the American government was keen on getting people to believe it was. It actually started in America. The Spanish flu started in various American barracks right at the end of the war. Now, America doesn't get actually involved in the war until very, very late, and we're going to talk a little bit about how America gets involved today, finishing up the war. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch over to the desktop PowerPoint view so that we can follow along. I actually have PowerPoint on my computer now, which is awesome. So we're going to swap over, and then I'm going to blow this up here, slideshow. I'm going to probably start back a little bit. I'll show you some of these pictures of, this is the Schlieffen Plan. Schlieffen Plan failed. Trench warfare, we talked about that. I'm just going to kind of quickly, briefly run through some of this stuff so you can get an idea of what the PowerPoint looks like. Talked about stalemate and how the war never really moved. There were a number of battles that resulted in a lot of deaths. And the Spanish flu accounts for even more towards the end of the war, because so many people at this time, wartime casualties are not always because people were shot or killed in battle or blown up or anything. It includes other things too, like friendly fire, but also disease. Lots and lots and lots of people die from disease during war. The close proximity in the trenches especially was a way for this disease to absolutely thrive. And again, people didn't have, people knew about quarantining. Quarantine's been around for a very long time. But when you're in the middle of the war, you can't just tell your troops to pack up and go home. Because one or the other side will continue attacking. So it results in the massive spread of the Spanish flu and countless deaths from it. But neither side is really able to break through the other in terms of the actual scope of the war. And here you can see some, these are actually German, no, they're not. They're British troops. You can tell by the helmets. The the British helmets and American helmets were very similar in World War I, though, so it's sometimes kind of difficult to tell the difference. World War II, it's a little bit easier to tell based on the uniform. But yeah, so this would be British troops with their helmets on there. And of course, remember, we supplied all sorts of things. It's, I think, an M1 Garand there to the British and the other allies, France and so on. So the Battle of Verdun was a very important battle in World War I. It began in February of 1916. This is where Germany was seeking a battle of attrition that would, quote-unquote, bleed France white, which is a phrase both in reference to the fact that when you bleed out, your skin turns pale because the blood cells are escaping your body and your skin turns very, very white looking. But it also refers, of course, to the fact that a white flag is signifies surrendering. So bleed France white. Now, France lost 540,000 men alone in the Battle of Verdun. Germany lost another nearly 500,000. It was the war's second bloodiest battle. Now, General Philippe Pétain is a guy whose name will come up again when we talk about World War II, because by that point, he's a high-ranking governmental official in France, and he actually ends up turning to be a Nazi collaborator in World War II, but he was the leader of the French forces, and it made him a national hero in France after World War I. Here you can see, it's kind of gross, I understand. Whoops, sorry about that. It's kind of gross, but this is trench foot. This is what happens when you're in the trenches, they fill up with water, and then your boots get soaked, and then that water soaks through your shoes and your socks and into your feet, and of course it's not clean water, it's dirty water, and who knows, all sorts of bacteria and other things are in there, and so it can cause literally the skin on your feet to just peel away, and it can actually kill you if you don't get it treated. Now, in this time, they don't have antibiotics, so trench foot would be really bad, and it's, of course, super painful. And here you can see, whoops, this is a super touchy mouse roller here. Okay, so this is kind of the general Western Front. Now, when we say Western Front, it sometimes confuses kids because it takes place in Eastern France. But when we're talking about Western Front, we're talking respective to Germany. So the Germans are attacking on the west in Eastern France, and they're attacking on the eastern side of Germany against Russia. So the Eastern Front is in Eastern Europe. The Western Front is in Western Europe. That's really what it's pertaining to. But you can see how much of the battle really took place right there in Eastern France, and it was devastating to the French economy, but also the French countryside, and there was all sorts of death and destruction. There's a couple of different significant things on this map here. The Battle of Verdun is listed right here. You can see it's kind of further a little bit down on the Western Front side. And these trenches, as I said, they're zigzagging all the way down. There's thousands of miles of trenches, both when you consider both the Western and Eastern Front, and they're dug in parallel fashion to one another. So you're constantly jumping over no man's land into the next guy's trench, and then they retreat to the trench behind them, and so on. And that somewhat explains why the war really doesn't move anywhere, is because you're constantly fighting back and forth over the same territories. There are a number of other battles, though, listed here. The Battle of the Marne was early on, and then there was actually another Battle of the Marne towards the end of the war. Battle of the Somme is another significant battle in World War I. Now, Ypres is how you say this, Y-P-R-E-S. It's a French word. It's difficult to pronounce, but the American troops didn't know how to pronounce Ypres, and so they called it Wipers. And there was a newspaper that was released in the middle of World War I, which is kind of a satirical newspaper about the pointlessness of the war. And so they called it the Wipers Times, as a reference to Ypres, the city of France there. And I always thought that was really funny. The Americans didn't even bother pronouncing it, just call it Wipers. Anyhow, so that's that. 1916, massive casualties, but neither side could break through. And then you have the Battle of the Somme, which began in July. This was the bloodiest battle of the war. The British lost 420,000 troops. The French lost another 200,000 troops. And then Germany lost 650,000 troops. So you can see that this is just people fighting and dying over the same lands. and really not making any headway either way. There was a very famous piece that came out 10 years after the war by a guy called Eric Remarque called All Quiet on the Western Front. Now, Eric Remarque, Ernest Hemingway, and a number of other authors from this time are often referred to as the lost generation, because this is what I was going to say earlier, is if you consider our modern times, this is the longest period of time we've gone without a significant global war. And so people have gotten very used to peacetime. And so this virus has really thrown people off because, pandemics and just in general plagues and other things like that were very, very common for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's the first time we've seen this happen in the modern era. And it's it's going to be a difficult thing to battle back from. But I want you to consider for a moment that it pales in comparison to somebody who was, say, born in about right around the turn of the 1900s, the 20th century. If they were born in 1900, that means that by the time that they were 14, World War I broke out. By the time that they were 18, World War I was over. By the time that they were 29, the stock market crashed and caused the Great Depression. By the time that they were 39, World War II broke out. And then, of course, not to mention the Spanish flu and other things like that, but people, there was a tremendous amount of loss during this time. And so they call these folks the lost generation. Is you could imagine they would look back on their lives and kind of wonder, what's the point? If humans are destined to just destroy one another, and they're just faced with, punch after punch after punch with respect to current events, you'd feel like you were ready to stop fighting. By the time that World War II broke out, and there would seem like so much senseless violence and death, and it has a significant effect on art, literature, and other things during this time, because by the time that you get to the end of World War I, people are really questioning what they believed about the world. Everything that they understood about their modern times, about rationalism, about reason, about the Industrial Revolution, about progress, and just about the human character is coming into question. But particularly I want to stick to that idea of humans being rational, because World War I, at the end of the day, people look back and they kind of say, what's the point? And they start to really question, we thought that humans were rational, and then we just killed each other to the tune of 10 million people or some ridiculously huge number. Maybe we're not quite as rational as we thought that we were. Maybe the things that we believe about the world aren't as correct as they were. And so this is where you get like Sigmund Freud with his psychoanalytic approach to psychology, which, there's a lot that could be said about Freud and the dubious measures that he used to collect data. His data was very sexist. His data was sometimes completely fabricated. And so Freud isn't exactly the most scientific of all psychologists. We need to get that out there. But it's his theory that people do things based on unconscious drives, things that they're not even aware of, that motivate human behavior, that lie beneath the surface. And that's really the signal hallmark of the era following World War I, is people questioning motives behind things, right? And when you think about Einstein, even, you can extrapolate it over to physics and think to yourself like, well, we had Newtonian physics that were these known unchanging laws about the universe that people had believed going back to the late 1600s when he wrote Principia. But Albert Einstein comes along and says, maybe what we believe about Newtonian physics isn't exactly right either. And he comes up with this entirely new suggestion of how physics works, which was the theory of relativity, and eventually translates into quantum physics and so on. And of course, quantum physics is a much more complicated explanation involving extremely high-level math that is well beyond my capacity to explain. But the notion of everything that we believe about the world, when it comes right down to the natural laws of physics, are being questioned, and we come up with new explanations for things. And that tends to be the way that things go in science, but in history as well, is that, you know, when we think about understanding truths cannot be derived without disbelief. And so if you're just constantly believing everything about science and not questioning new things that are contradictory data or that seem not to match your understanding of reality, that requires you to come up with new solutions, new evidence, new studies to explain such phenomena. And so between literature, science, psychology, and various other things, you know, art and so on, there's all sorts of new movements in art that happen after. It's trying to explain a world that really no longer makes sense. So there's a number of new technological advances. We talked a bit about these, machine guns being probably the most important one because of just the sheer rate of fire that is able to be shot against your enemies. Also tanks, airplanes. One of the most famous of the pilots of this time, now when planes fight in the sky, that's called a dogfight. And we talked a bit about that last time, but airplanes looked more like this in those days, biplanes and sometimes even triplanes. And this is a replica of he becomes known as the Red Baron, but his real name was Manfred von Richthofen. And Manfred von Richthofen became well known for becoming one of the most deadly dogfight pilots in World War I. He had a tremendous number of kills from the German side, and it was in part because the Germans, leave it to the Germans to develop a machine gun that could be mounted to the front of the plane and was synchronized with the propeller, so that when you shot a bullet from behind the propeller, it would go between the propeller, so you don't just shoot your propeller off and crash your own plane. And this was a significant technology that developed during World War I that allowed the German pilots like the Red Baron to be able to be so successful. And then in response, of course, the British and the French developed their own fighter squadrons. And then the British actually used planes to bomb Zeppelin bases in Germany. Back in the olden days, it wasn't clear, believe it or not, that planes would be the main flight technology. There was a huge competition in the early days of flight between blimps or Zeppelins and planes, and a lot of folks thought that Zeppelins were the way of the future, airships. And Zeppelins fall out of favor not only because they're slower, but because they blow up very easily. And especially from Germany. Germany doesn't have any natural helium reserves, and so they had to fill their Zeppelins with hydrogen, which is highly, highly explosive. And so when the British realized this, it's quite easy to take down these Zeppelins, blow them up. There was a very famous Zeppelin called the Hindenburg, of course, named after Paul von Hindenburg, who was the one of the main generals of World War I. And it gets shot down in it crashes in the 1930s in New Jersey somewhere, if I remember right. And you know, there's a famous clip of like, oh, the humanity. And I think that they've used that clip in SpongeBob and other things like that. If you've ever seen a giant blimp blowing up, you know, it was often referenced in cartoons and other things for a long time. Not many folks died, but it was, of course, quite a sight to see. And you can see some images here of various planes and so on, and there's so much more I could go into, but I really do need to move forward. Poison gas, U-boats. This is obviously a U-boat that was sunk and washed ashore, but the Germans were, you know, particularly devastating with their U-boat effectiveness and against British ships. Now, the British and the Russians also had submarines, but it's really the U-boats, the German submarines. Unterseeboot is what U-boat stands for, which literally just translates to underwater boat. The Germans are not usually very fancy with naming things. Submarine sounds so much cooler, but underwater boat is literally what it is. And these U-boats were very, very difficult to detect in World War I. They're underwater. You cannot see them until they're right up on you. And so one of the ways that they battled the U-boats was traveling in convoys. So that if a U-boat was to expose itself, there were a number of other ships there that would be able to retaliate using things like depth charges and stuff, which is basically an explosive barrel that is dropped into the water and blows up underwater. But because of the pressure, if it blows up next to a submarine rather, it's going to blow a hole right in the hull, and it'll sink and kill everybody on it. And that's one of the reasons that U-boats are so dangerous to serve on in World War I and in World War II. The attrition rate of crews that served on submarines is extremely high, because there's no chance that you might be able to escape the ship and, like, you know, have a life raft or a lifeboat or something like that as you would on a surface ship. So U-boats, when they're blown up or sunk, it kills everybody on board. And so high death rates on submarines. And it's really one of the main reasons that the United States gets involved in the war is what they called unrestricted U-boat warfare. Now, another aspect of we'll talk more about unrestricted U-boat warfare in a little bit, but one of the qualities of World War I is that they began using chemical weapons like poison gas, mustard gas, and the thing about gas is it can be super effective, but you better hope that the wind doesn't change directions, because it did various times throughout the war. And if the wind is in your favor, you can use poison gas quite effectively, and the gas is heavier than air, so it stays low to the ground, and it'll sink into trenches, which is the whole point of it, because you want people to escape the poison gas by jumping out of the trench. And of course, when they jump out of the trench, then it's easier to spot them and mow them down with machine gun fire. Poison gas was horrible. It burned people's eyes out, burned people's throats. And, you know, obviously, if you didn't have a gas mask, it could ultimately kill you from asphyxiation. Poison gas was used by both sides. Gas bombs were used by both sides. But as I said, if the wind changed direction, it could very quickly turn into a weapon that you're using against yourself. And that did happen on a number of occasions during World War I. So these are the sorts of things that you start to see troops wearing as the war wanes on, as gas masks. They become necessary. You can see here, even on this mule or whatever this is, donkey. I'm not a equestrian, so I have no idea what this is. I don't think it's a horse, though. And so they would even put gas masks on horses to try to prevent them from having as much of an effect on the animals, which were heavily used in World War I, which sounds ridiculous because, you know, you can't even imagine these days an American troop riding a horse into battle, but sure enough, they did so back in the day. And you can see here this man has been affected by poison gas, and it's burned him, and he has bandages all over his hands. Also, they started putting armor on trains. This is more or less just a regular train that they dressed up with a bunch of sheet metal. And armored trains would be used to supply troops and stuff like that. There's what a Zeppelin looks like in the early days. Their design does change over time. This is another image of a Zeppelin, and these would be the things that the British started using their planes to blow up. On the Eastern Front, basically General von Hindenburg and General von Ludendorff defeated the invading Russian armies at Tannenberg, and this really turned the tide of the war in the East and forced the Russians to once and for all surrender in the war. When they surrender, by this point you already have a full-scale Russian revolt going on, led by a guy named Vladimir Lenin, who had been injected directly into the chaos of Russia during the war by the Germans. He had been exiled in Switzerland, and they basically took this revolutionary figure whose brother had attempted to assassinate the Tsar years back, and threw him directly into the political upheaval of Russia at this time, which of course is a working class upheaval because of the nature of Russia's lagging behind in industrialization. The working class in Russia was particularly affected by wartime because it's those folks who are the ones who go and serve on the front lines. So Vladimir Lenin goes back to Russia. He promises the people something called the April Theses: peace, land, and bread. So peace meaning get out of World War I, land meaning take land away from the nobles and the church and redistribute it, and then bread meaning that people were starving. So this was essentially his three-point plan to the Russian Revolution. And by the time that December 1917 rolls around, Vladimir Lenin has already, staged his revolt, and he sues for peace with the Germans. The Germans do not let Russia go from the war easily. They had to give up a quarter of their territory. But right at the same time, Vladimir Lenin was very much hedging his bet because he knew that the Americans were entering into the war right at the same time as they were leaving the war, and this gave them some hope that the Germans would not be able to last against the Western Front of the British, French, and the Americans, and they were correct. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was this treaty that negotiated Russia's exit from World War I. Shortly thereafter, as a result of the Russian Revolution, a civil war broke out in Russia, and it creates mass upheaval there, where even more people die, this time not fighting against the Germans, but fighting against one another, in response to the Bolshevik, aka Communist Party revolution, led by Vladimir Lenin. So when the actual war ends and the Germans are defeated, that results in that quarter of Russian territory that had been given over to the Germans by the Russians so that they could safely exit the war, back to Russia after the end of the war. Gosh, this thing is touchy. Okay, Erich von Ludendorff, very well-known general of World War I, one of the highest-ranking generals in the German military. As is Paul von Hindenburg, who's over here on the left-hand side. Now, in the middle here, this is Kaiser Wilhelm II, actually. So you got Ludendorff, Hindenburg, and then in the center, Kaiser Wilhelm II. These guys, although you might look at them and say, oh, they're just Germans, keep in mind they are not Nazis, okay? Nazis don't come until later on down the line, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Now, there are some guys who serve in the German military as lower-ranking officers in World War I who also end up serving in World War II just 20 years later. But again, you got to be careful, because there is a difference between the German military, the Wehrmacht, which was made up of primarily Nazis without question, but there's also this whole other branch of the German military in World War II that is the political party military, known as the Schutzstaffel, the SS, and those were the ones, the hardcore party Nazis who were extremely, extremely anti-Semitic and waged, the Holocaust against Jewish folks and others. And so, but again, these guys really don't have anything to do with that. These are just Germans in World War I. The Gallipoli Campaign was another significant aspect of World War I, which was the attempt by the West to try to resupply Russia from the south through the Ottoman Empire. Now, remember, the Ottoman Empire had actually sided with the Germans, and so the Ottoman Turks are fighting with the Germans in this war. And it's one of the most underrated or undervalued efforts in the war, because the Turks fought way, way harder than the British thought that they were going to. And in the Gallipoli Campaign, which I can show you a map here of what that looks like. Here's Greece down here to give you an idea of where we're at. This is the Balkans. Here's Austria-Hungary. This area right here is where they're trying to get through to supply Russia from the south. But again, because Turkey, aka the Ottoman Empire, had sided with the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, getting through what was called the Dardanelles Strait here was not going to be easy. And this piece of land that juts out from the western side of Turkey is known as the Gallipoli Peninsula, and this is where the British and Australian various other forces were trying to come up through this Gallipoli Dardanelles Strait here to get up through to Russia. It does not succeed, and they are stopped right here in Gallipoli. In very short order, they have another trench warfare stalemate situation on their hands, in large part due to the really, really efficacious fighting of the Turks in Gallipoli. Talking a little bit more about unrestricted U-boat warfare, one of the things that really upset the Americans during the war was when a British ship by the name of the Lusitania, which had been carrying 128 American passengers, was sunk. Now, the Lusitania, if you look at this, it looks like a ship very similar to the Titanic. It's because it's of the same generation. It may have even been made by White Star Lines, which was the or Cunard, one of the two. But one of the major ship makers of this time, or you might even say it looks like the Queen Mary docked permanently now over in Long Beach. But the Lusitania was a passenger liner ship, and so this was not meant to be a military ship. It's a civilian ship carrying people on vacation and whatever. However, as I said, the United States, were supplying the British. And one of the ways in which they were secretly doing this, because of the U-boats, is that they didn't want to use merchant marine ships that would otherwise be carrying large amounts of ammunition and other things, which would have been put a red target on their back for the U-boats. So they started secretly transporting military supplies in the hulls, in the cargo hulls of these passenger liner ships. And what that results in is the Germans figuring it out and extending the warfare to sinking any ship that was not a German ship, essentially. So this ship sinks, it kills 128 Americans, and America's like, whoa, Germany, you better, check your role here, because you can't be killing Americans. We're not even in the war. So Germany is like, well, look, we'll stop doing it they did agree to stop doing it for a while, because they did not want to see U.S. entering into the war. However, the Germans also said, look, we know what you're doing. Stop transporting military supplies on passenger ships if you want us to stop sinking them. And the Americans are like, okay, fingers crossed, we'll do that. Yeah, sure thing. Well, they kept doing it. And so the Germans, when they start to get desperate, resume unrestricted U-boat warfare and start sinking ships again. And this, again, is a very significant reason as to why the United States enters into the war in the first place. The Lusitania was kind of one of those events, kind of like a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11 or whatever. It stokes rage in the American population. And when people are angry or when they're fearful, they have a tendency to go along with policies that maybe they otherwise would have been a little bit more on the fence about. And so the Lusitania is one of these press things that gets a whole lot of attention from the American government, but also from the American people, and they're outraged at the deaths of innocent Americans in a European war that they're not even involved in. And there's the Lusitania. And here it is in the New York Times. Lusitania sunk by a submarine, probably 1,000 dead, twice torpedoed off Irish coast, sinks in 15 minutes. Americans aboard included Vanderbilt and Frohman. Vanderbilt is a very big name in American industry at that time. In fact, if you know Anderson Cooper, who is the host of Anderson Cooper 360 or whatever, he's been on CNN for a million years. Anderson Cooper is actually a descendant of the Vanderbilt family, so he is kind of one of the Vanderbilt American industrialist heirs from the early 1900s. Random fact for you. There's an artist's rendition of the sinking of the Lusitania. And then there was also kind of this unknown war that happened in the very, 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 very tail end of the war, where the Americans, it's called the Archangel Expedition, where the Allies were trying to prevent that Bolshevik communist victory from happening during the Russian Civil War. And so they interjected a bunch of troops, but it also was not successful in stopping the communist revolt there. Allies, they sent troops into Siberia to prevent the Japanese control of that region, to rescue thousands of marooned Czech soldiers and prevent the Bolsheviks from getting new weapon supplies. But in effect, this really contributed to prolonging the Russian Civil War, probably longer than it would have gone on, as the Bolshevik army was fighting against the Russian White Army, which were anti-communist. Excuse me, I have the hiccups. So, another aspect of both World War I and World War II that is very significant is total war. And what this is involving mass civilian populations in the war effort. Now, that's not always with picking up guns and going and fighting on the front lines, although it does involve massive conscription, aka a draft, where you force folks to go and serve for you. So all sides, Americans, Germans, British, French, etc., started drafting the most able-bodied young men in their countries to serve. But in some cases, civilian populations themselves become the targets. So early in the war, Germany used Zeppelins to bomb London. They did the very same thing in World War II with planes. The British blockade resulted in significant starvation of Germany, as they were landlocked and having difficult time supplying themselves. The news gets censored. Propaganda is, contributing to, influencing, persuading people in that weren't yet in the war to go and join. And we see intense nationalism demanding support from the entire population at this time. News gets censored, intense nationalism. Oh, I said that already. Some historians contend that Germany increased its belligerency in the 1890s in order to rally the masses behind the government and slow down the growth of the Social Democratic Party. So in 1914, which was by then the largest party in the Reichstag, the Social Democratic Party agreed to support the war as part of the civil peace with the Kaiser. And the same may have been true in Britain, as the issue of Irish independence dominated the headlines prior to the war there, and during the war. The British propaganda effectively demonized the Germans, known as the Huns. It was a pejorative term used against the Germans by the British. I know that Huns sounds like it would be referring to the Hungarians, but it was actually the Germans were the Huns. And you can see an example of propaganda here. Step into your place, and you can see the civilian population gradually turning into the military here. That's total war effort for you. Also, economic production during total war was focused on the war effort. So we see a crackdown of free market capitalism in even the most democratic capitalist nations, where private companies essentially get commandeered by the government to make supplies for the war. Civilians also start to buy war bonds during this time. Let me explain what war bonds are in a minute. I'll get to that. But rationing of food, where people were trying to use less food so that food could be sent to the front lines, was another major aspect of total war. Don't eat more than you need. Companies that otherwise might have been making shoes are now making boots. Some companies that were otherwise making cars are now making armored cars, and so on and so forth. And munitions factories and so on. So we see a crackdown of private industry by the government to now support, what's going on. And we've seen a little bit of that actually in the COVID thing, where private companies have, been paid by the government to start making other things, masks and other supplies that are pertinent to, fighting the COVID. I'll explain what war bonds are in a minute. Another major aspect of this is women fighting in the, or contributing to the total war effort. Now, sometimes women did fight on the front lines, or at least served on the front lines as nurses and other things like that. But most famously, the women's roles in the economy were to go and replace the men who were going and fighting in the front lines in the factories. And so women working in factories was a really significant aspect of World War I that enabled them to, after the war, be able to fight for their right for suffrage, which they still did not have at that time. You can see a woman working in a munitions factory. And here's women making probably tank parts or something like that. There's some more propaganda examples for you. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? And you can see here the girl and so on. And this guy's kind of looking at you as though like he's got a look of concern, like he's going to have to explain to his kids that he didn't fight, and he'll be labeled by his kids or others as a coward or whatever. And that was they preyed on gender roles to be able to encourage or persuade people to join the war effort. Another very, very famous World War I propaganda poster here. This is, if you can see, let's dissect this a little bit. Destroy this mad brute. Well, this is, he's got a German, you can tell that this is a Allied side propaganda poster, because he's got a German-Prussian helmet on there with the classic spike at the top. Also, he's got a Kaiser mustache. The Kaiser Wilhelm II had a mustache very similar to that. And they're depicting the Germans as a brutish, scary-looking ape. And this is a very common tactic in propaganda. It's used even in modern-day times to dehumanize your enemy so that you don't feel so bad about killing them, because if they're not humans, then you don't feel guilt about it as much. And so, but of course, they are humans. And this is a way of encouraging, racist, but also just discriminatory beliefs about your enemy. And here he is holding hostage Lady Liberty, who is often depicted bare-chested. And so it's also at this time, motion pictures were starting to become well-known. King Kong, very famous story. So it's preying on people's popular knowledge of that. King Kong taking Jane hostage at the top of the building or whatever. He's also holding a club there that says culture on it, spelled with a K, which a bunch of gore on the end of it. And this is a bat that's meaning to beat people into submission with German culture. You can see now the Germans never invaded America, of course, but there was fear that if they won the war against the British and the French, that they may have engaged the Americans in a war. And so this is an American propaganda poster, because you can see Europe on the other side there, a war-torn Europe on the far side in the very background. And then that's the ocean. And then now he's stepping onto American soil, and this is to encourage people to enlist. Women of Britain say go. Again, playing on gender roles. Women, the idea being that a real man will go and fight in the war. And women would rather see you go and fight and defend your nation than see you stay at home and stuff. Now, the extent to which that is true, of course, is very questionable, because there are a lot of women who maybe don't get the credit that they should for having to bear through. When you're killed in battle, depending on whatever your religious beliefs are or whatever, who knows what happens in the afterlife. But for the people who have to live through the battle, the women who are at home and see their husbands die, or the girls who see their fathers die, or anyone else who sees, the mothers who see their sons die, or nephews, or uncles, or cousins, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter who it is in relation to you. It's the women who have to struggle through surviving it. The war is over for somebody who is killed, but the war very much lives on in the hearts and minds of the women who see their loved ones perish. Will you have a part in victory? This is as a product of the idea of rationing the food out, right to the National War Garden Commission, Washington, D.C., for free books on gardening, canning, and drying, so that you can supply your own food. You don't need to purchase foods from stores or other things like that. Those stored foods can go and be sent off to the front lines. Don't waste bread, another rationing one. Save 2 thick slices every day and defeat the U-boat. In other words, don't eat more than you need to. And then, of course, here you have the role of the dignified colonial subject. So you have a Royal West African frontier fighter here who is being depicted in a noble way to encourage folks not to practice the deeply seated racism that most folks believed in at this time, due to all sorts of different things like social Darwinism and just the general social discourse of that time placed Africans at the bottom rung of society, I guess. And you have to imagine, again, how confusing the world must have been for these folks who really had nothing to do at all with the war in Europe, even less than the Europeans themselves did. And somehow they find themselves fighting across the world and in Europe even. So each side aimed at starving out the enemy by cutting off vital supplies to the civilian population. There was an increased and centralized control by warring regimes. Essentially, George Clemenceau, often referred to as the Tiger of France, created a dictatorship and really took direct control of all aspects of public and private life during the war. Germany became the world's first totalitarian regime in order to control the war effort, and the British economy was also largely planned and regulated at this time. So, as I said earlier, cracking down on private industry in the name of public warfare, public good. War promoted greater social equality in some sense, which blurred class distinctions and lessened the gap between the rich and the poor, because, the poor folks are the ones who are suffering the brunt of these attacks and deaths and affect their lives much more heavily than the wealthy populations, which is a classic throughout time, essentially. However, one of the things that's really interesting about the war, you might think that because Russia was so conservative that the women would have had the worst place in society. Believe it or not, the value placed on the lives in Russia is so low that actually particularly in World War II after the rise of Stalin, women and men in Russia actually have a much more equitable social place, because everybody is so desperately poor and their conditions are so bad that it really, the Russians could care less what biological sex you are. They just need to continue fighting the war. And this comes in the form of both fighting in the actual war itself on the front lines, but also working in factories and other things like that. Diplomacy during the war. So in I don't even touch it and it moves. Okay, diplomacy during the war. 1915, the neutral Italy entered the war against the Central Powers and its former allies with the promise of getting back some Austrian and Balkan territory, what was known as Italia Irredenta, unredeemed Italy, and some German colonies and Turkish territories as well. Now, the extent to which they get what they want is definitely questionable. In fact, Italy leaves the Treaty of Versailles, the peace meeting that takes place after World War I, because they are clearly not going to get what they want. And then they say that the straw that broke the camel's back is an old school phrase that just means that if you're loading up a camel with a whole bunch of stuff, you keep loading. There's a whole bunch of stuff already weighing down the camel, and you put that one last piece of straw in there, and that's the thing that breaks the camel's back. They say that is in World War I, the straw that broke the camel's back that brought the United States into the war was when Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the United States. Now, of course, the Zimmerman Note isn't nearly as important as U-boat warfare and why the United States enters into the war. However, nonetheless, it's because the Germans had tried to encourage Mexico, who the United States had just fought against about 65 years earlier, in the Mexican-American War in 1848, to try to distract America from becoming involved in Europe. And in return, Germany said that they would, give back much of southwest U.S., which included Arizona, New Mexico, even parts of Texas and California, back to Mexico, which they believed was their land anyway at that time, or at least for a while had believed that was their land. And this is the thing that encourages the United States to get involved. The Balfour Note was a totally different thing. This is where Arabs and Jews in Palestine were actually promised autonomy if they joined the Allies. And Britain declared with the Balfour Note sympathy for the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Now, as much as this might seem as a promising thing for the Zionist movement, which had been taking place across Europe at this time thanks to Theodor Herzl, the Jewish author who suggested that the Jews deserved a national homeland. This might seem like it's a nice thing to do for Jewish folks to create a state for them, but really this is dressed up in the idea that the Brits, just like most people in Europe, didn't want to see Jewish folks living in their own lands. And so this was a convenient way for them to expel Jewish folks from Europe. Now, of course, Israel, which is the current Jewish national nation state, is an important ally of the United States and Western Europe in the Middle East, and it doesn't get created until after World War II. So this is not something that's going to happen overnight. But after the Balfour Note, or sometimes known as the Balfour Declaration, it really widens the prospect that Jewish folks will be relocated from Europe and other places across the globe to the Middle East, specifically in Palestine, which is unfortunate for the Palestinians, of course, because the Palestinians had been promised by the British autonomy and being provided their own nation state, which of course never comes to fruition even to this day. So when Jewish folks start relocating into the Palestinian lands, after having not resided there for about 2,000 years, it creates, of course, a huge conflict between the people who believed that to be their homeland and the other people who believe that to be their homeland. And so to this day, for the past 100 years roughly, the Palestinians and the Jews in Israel have been fighting over those territories. Jewish folks, particularly as a result of the last probably 8-10 years or so, maybe even a little longer, have had increasingly harsh policies against the Palestinians living there, including things like walling Palestinians into certain areas and so on, which is not good. And there's a very strong across the globe, not just in Israel, but in Israel, but in other places. There's been this strong kind of press towards a resurgence of nationalism recently, and it's a concerning thing because the folks who are the eldest, parts of the population in the United States these days don't remember World War II because so many of them were born either during the war or after the war, and so your eldest people in their 60s, 70s, even into their early 80s today, don't really have a sense of the catastrophe that excess nationalism created in an era before they were born. And this has led to, in my view, some very scary prospects for the future. Hopefully, the COVID virus has distracted humans from enough for the short term to not cause some sort of major war. But nonetheless, this move towards nationalist sentiments, I don't see it being particularly helped by COVID, because what has happened is that world trade has dropped, and the minute that COVID broke out, the nations went to protect themselves, and trade drops, and tariffs are put in place. Domestic protective tariffs are put in place, which is a regulatory policy that hinders global trade, makes foreign goods more expensive, and this, that, the other. So prices go up, and people struggle with that. So yeah, intense nationalism these days, across the board, due to globalization creating a framework where people have been able to migrate more freely across the globe in the last 30, 40 years than ever before, has meant that nationalist sentiments have been stoked due to xenophobia, which is a fear of other cultures invading your own, or somehow, whittling away at people's own national identity. And so this is a concerning trend, of course, because migration too is a major aspect of the economy. You need, in Western developed nations, highly developed nations tend to go through a period where the population ages, because people move to urban areas, they have fewer children. The number of kids that people have, or just don't have any children at all, and then the number of kids that people have means that if you have a couple, you need to have 2 children to sustain the population evenly. So you need to have people, if you want to have population growth, for every couple there is, they need to have 2 or more kids. The average across the board needs to be higher than 2 to have a growing economy. If people start only having 2 kids, or start only having 1 kid, what this does is, over time, it very quickly creates a scenario where you have, if you look at a population pyramid, which is the distribution of segments of the population by age in a single moment. So if we look at a population pyramid rather in say 2020, as opposed to 1920, the American population is going to eventually kind of plateau. Now, right now, we're still growing. But that's in part due to what I was mentioning, which is migration. And that's why migration becomes so significant for developed nations, is because when nations develop and people start having fewer kids, you need migrants to be able to come in, both to continue themselves by way of just them coming to your country. You're growing your population because more people are moving to your nation. However, then too, the migrants coming into usually a working class scenario, they have a tendency to, working class folks, lower, I don't mean to say lower class, but generally speaking, economically underprivileged folks do have a tendency to have more children. And so this helps to continue population growth as well, which is hand in hand with economic growth. If your economy, if you want your economy to grow, one of the most significant ways in which you can do that is to continue to have your population grow. So I guess all of this is to say that we are going to see, in your lifetimes at least, probably some significant changes to population distributions, and the role that nationalism plays in that. Make no mistake, hopefully one day you'll look back and say, boy, that old guy, Mr. Knight, back at Eleanor G., I think you're Swellenor Roosevelt High School, knew a thing or two about what he was talking about when he said that nationalism was going to, have an effect on population distribution. All right, so, golly, this thing is sensitive. Okay, so diplomacy during the war. The president of the United States at this time is Woodrow Wilson. Actually, you know what? Give me just 1 second. I gotta take care of something really quick. I'll be back in like a minute and a half. Just give me 1 second. I gotta deal with something. Okay, sorry about that brief intermission there. Let me take a minute to, I'm going to switch back. I wanted to take a minute to explain the notion of war bonds, because sometimes war bonds can be difficult for kids to understand what they are. Really for anyone. A lot of people just don't really have an idea of what war bonds are. So let's say that you were, okay, so let's start with talking about if you're just an individual. Okay, so if you're an individual and you need to get a loan for money, you need to borrow money. Probably the number one place that you're going to go is a bank, right? And when you go to the bank checks a number of different things to make sure that you're a reliable candidate to lend money to. And then what will happen is they'll lend you money, they'll give you an interest rate, which means that you're going to be paying back more money over time because they collect interest on the loan. So over time, they'll charge you X amount of interest, and you pay back more over time than what you actually borrowed. Okay, so that's how a traditional loan works from a bank. But you got to ask yourself, what happens if governments start getting low on money? Where does the government go to borrow money? And the simple answer is they go to the people. And this is where war bonds come in. So there isn't really now, of course, these days, we don't really see war bonds. You can still buy government bonds. I mean, you can still buy them, and a lot of people do, especially in times like this where stocks are kind of precarious. Like people may not be so confident in buying stocks right now because if there's an economic downturn, you're going to lose money on your investment. So one of the ways in which the government has a way of ensuring that they can borrow money to pay for things in a short-term period, or at least over the course of you can buy them for different lengths. You can get war bonds that are 2 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 20 years. You can buy all sorts of different bonds. And the lengthier the term, generally speaking, the more you'll get back on that. And the reason is this: what the government does is they say, look, we need money. We don't want to take out a loan from against the government. They really are kind of effectively taking a loan out against themselves, because the people are what make up the government. It's kind of a complex thing to explain, but the idea basically being this: the government, one of the ways in which the government supplies or collects money, is that they issue bonds to people, which are similar to stocks, except for you're not investing in a private company. You're investing in... Mochi, you are such a little troublemaker. Okay. So look how good he is, though. He hears me call his name, and then he quits, and then now he's going to go back. Moch, hey. What are you doing? Mochi. You see him looking at me? He knows that I'm talking to him. He's smart. Okay, so one of the ways in which the government collects revenue or collects money for the short term is they say, look, you can buy this bond, and it's like buying a stock, except for you're buying essentially stock in the American government. And what they will do, let's say that you had $5,000 that you had sitting in your bank account, and you're not wanting to invest that in stocks because times are precarious. What you can do is you can take that $5,000 and buy a government bond. And what that means is that you're essentially giving the government a loan. You're operating in this case as the bank, and the government agrees to pay you usually a lower interest rate than what like a stock will give you. So if you buy stocks, you can annually, if you look at it over time, roughly percentage return on stocks over the course of a single year is usually about 6 or 7%. Well, the government is not going to give you 6 or 7%, but they might give you 2 or 3%. And that means that over time, and usually it's enough to keep up with inflation, which is the amount of money increasing in circulation. But, inflation is not really a good thing, because what that means over time is that the value of your dollar is going to go down. And so what they will do is they'll say, look, you give us $5,000 over the course of the next 5 years. What you will do is you will be able to sell your bond back to the government for more than what you for more than what they bought it for. So, like, for example, you have this bond. It's a ticket that says, it's basically a ticket from the government that says, I owe you $5,000 plus whatever percent interest. So let's say it's 3% interest. So you'll get your money back plus some when the bond expires. And so this is the way in which governments fund part of the costs of the war. Hopefully that makes sense. I know it's kind of a complex thing to explain, but that's essentially how they work. Okay, let's get back to President Wilson here. So Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. Did I properly? Yeah, I did. Okay. Sometimes I forget to switch it over to desktop view. Okay. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. He's not like a modern day Democrat, though. After Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was also a Democrat, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president in 1933, I think he's elected in 32, and he is takes the oath of office in 33. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president, there is a party realignment that happens, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes about 20 years for it really fully to take place, even longer than that, really. It's not until we see Eisenhower as president in the 1950s that we've really seen a complete realignment of the political parties, where the Democrats, who were traditionally, during Wilson's time, from the South, turn over to Republicans being traditionally in the South. And that's in large part due to the policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which were, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a president who, because he served in the Great Depression and because he was the president during the vast majority of World War II, instituted a number of public reforms, social reform programs that traditionally Democrats would absolutely have staunchly opposed. But he single-handedly contributes to this realignment where Democrats start to become more and more supportive of social policies that assist the labor class, the working class. And then Republicans become more in defense of the free market. And so over time, we see this transition to where we are today. So when we talk about Woodrow Wilson being a Democrat, he's like an old school Southern Democrat. Actually, one of the interesting fact about Woodrow Wilson, he is the first president to have a showing of a film, a motion picture in the White House. And the motion picture that was played was a movie called Birth of a Nation, which is a disturbing film in many ways, because the protagonists, the heroes of the movie Birth of a Nation, are the Ku Klux Klan. And that is obviously an uncomfortable fact. That the first movie shown in the White House was where the Ku Klux Klan is saving the day. Obviously incredibly disturbing. But so Woodrow Wilson is probably not super racist, not really probably not the most gleaming record in history. Although one thing that we have to give credit to Wilson for is that, in spite of all of his extraordinarily racist policies, he marks a change himself in terms of presidents, because he's the first Ivy League educated president that he has a degree in, I think, like economics or something like that from Princeton, if I'm remembering right. And so he's an incredibly intelligent man. And he is all about spreading democracy, for better or for worse. And so Wilsonian democracy, which you'll learn more about when you take American history, is about spreading democracy to the rest of the world, or at least to the rest of the world that he cared about. Now, Woodrow Wilson, because of his kind of erudite nature, is this guy who comes up with this really prolific diplomatic policy called the 14 points. And what this was before Wilson went to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the war. So he wrote it up in January of 1918, which is about 11 months before the end of the war. When the war ends, Wilson brings his 14-point plan, which was a plan for peace after the war, to the European peace meetings at the Palace of Versailles, which incidentally again plays another significant role in our class because of, we've talked about the Palace of Versailles a bunch of different times, but once again, a major significant reason that the Palace of Versailles is such an amazing historical landmark is because the peace for World War I was negotiated at the palace. And so he brings this to the Palace of Versailles, where these peace meetings are being held. And some of the provisions of Wilson's 14 points were to get rid of secret treaties so that alliances weren't formed behind other nations' back. Freedom of the seas, of course, is directly related to U-boat warfare. Remove economic barriers, try and open free trade up again. Reduction of armament burdens, meaning try to reduce the size of militaries. The promise of self-determination, aka independence for a number of different oppressed minority groups like the Poles, the Czechs, and so on, which for so long had not had their own nation states in Europe and had been under the influence of, say, the Germans or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or even the Balkan region and so on. Adjustment, another more of these ideas he had: adjustment of colonial claims in the interests of both the native folks and the colonizers, adjustment of Italy's borders along ethnic lines so that Italy gets back their territories with Italian people living in Italy, German evacuation of Russia, giving back Russia that quarter of Russian territory, which by this point the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had already been negotiated, the restoration of Belgium to its sovereignty, the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France, which had been taken by the Germans at the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, evacuation and restoration of the Balkans, return of Schleswig-Holstein to Denmark, which had been taken by the Germans in 1861 maybe, or somewhere, I can't remember exactly the year, but that was one of the Prusso-Danish War was one of the first ones. So they wanted to give that back to Denmark. Adjustment of Italy's border. When I say one of the first ones, I meant was one of the first ones under Bismarck. Adjustment of Italy's border. Oh, I already said that one. Autonomy for non-Turkish parts of the Turkish Empire, and so on. But the most important point of his plan was something called the League of Nations. Wilson wanted to create this diplomatic forum where different nations could come together and discuss policies before it resulted in just declaring war on one another and having a whole other collapse of the globe into warfare. So this international organization, which becomes known as the League of Nations, is part of Wilson's 14 points. Now, if you know anything about the League of Nations, it ultimately ends up failing to be able to do what it was supposed to do, which was to prevent warfare from happening, as just 20 years after the end of World War I, World War II is already underway. So he brings this policy to Europe. Here's Woodrow Wilson. And the Meuse-Argonne offensive is a very important one. This is where the Germans transfer all of their divisions after defeating Russia to the Western Front, and they mount a massive offensive. But we are no longer talking about the German military of 1914 anymore. This is a tired, war-torn Germany now that is fighting against not just the British and the French, but a brand new, fresh United States. It's kind of, I don't know if you guys heard, Mike Tyson's returning back to boxing. I always compare this to a boxing metaphor. If you imagine the Germans being like two major heavyweight boxers who have been fighting for 10, 12 rounds, and then you have a fresh Mike Tyson that enters the ring at the last minute to fight alongside one of the fighters against Germany. That's kind of the situation that we see develop at the tail end of the war, because America's coming in with all of their hot, nationalism and fresh troops and other things like that, minus the Spanish flu, and before long we see a very significant change in the tide of war, and the Central Powers very quickly seek peace based on the 14 points, believing that they're going to get fair treatment during the Treaty of Versailles negotiations, which they don't. So Germany agrees to an armistice, which began on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. So November 11th at 11 a.m. It was determined that the fighting would stop and that now peace negotiations would take place and a treaty would be drawn up. Wilhelm II at that time is forced to step down from the throne. The German Empire collapses, what is known as the Second Reich, the Third Reich being, of course, the Nazi Party, and he fled to the Dutch Republic, Holland. So the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 is when the Big Four, David Lloyd George from Britain, George Clemenceau from France, Woodrow Wilson from the United States, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy came together to determine, not really discuss, but determine what was going to happen with Germany now that the war was over. The Central Powers, both Germany and Austria-Hungary, were excluded from the negotiations because France was really concerned with its own future security and another war with Germany. Italy eventually left the conference because they were angry that they were not going to get some of the territories they had been promised by the Allies. And in 1919, about a year later, now the Treaty of Versailles negotiations were not supposed to, these talks outside of Paris were not supposed to last much longer than a month or so, but it takes a very long time for them to negotiate, in part because of just how hurt France is from the war. They're hurt, they're angry, they're upset. And very quickly, the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson brought along with him, slowly but surely, point by point, gets thrown out in favor of France punishing Germany. And the British, too. The British maybe a little bit less than the French, but the French had seen most of the warfare in their own country. And so the British may not have had the same degree of anger or hostility towards the Germans, although there was plenty there, too. That the French did. And so a number of different mandates were created for former colonies and territories of the Central Powers. Much of the Middle East was now controlled by Britain and France. They split up those territories into what effectively become colonies for a short period of time in places like Syria and Iraq and Jordan and so on, Lebanon, and even down into further south, Saudi Arabia and so on. Okay, so the Versailles Treaty, the most important part of the Treaty of Versailles ends up being Article 231. Article 231 placed sole blame of the war on Germany and blamed the entire war on Germany for having written the blank check, as I mentioned before, to Austria-Hungary, and really, really rapidly escalated the war back in 1914. So Germany, after the war, thanks to Article 231, is going to be forced to pay huge, almost all of the reparations to Britain and France by way of both supplying them with coal and other industrial, raw material type goods, but also by way of money. And so the German and Army Navy get severely reduced. The Rhineland gets completely demilitarized. The Saar coal mines in Western Germany are taken over by France. And Germany lost all of its colonies, which really proved not to be that important to Germany in the first place, if we're being honest. But they do lose their colonies and some of their territory as well in Europe. So the League of Nations does get created. That's one of the points of Wilson's 14 points that manages to stick around, but it is a flawed piece because this flawed negotiation is going to create almost the exact inverse problem, which is that Germany is going to be excluded from the League of Nations, as is Russia, since they're in the middle of a civil war and they're facing a communist revolution there. Germany does eventually get into the League of Nations years later, but by that point it's a bit too late. Their economy is in dire straits, and they're kind of a mess. The League of Nations, and just in general, the entire Treaty of Versailles you can't just allow the United States. The president doesn't act as a sovereign leader. He can't just go and do whatever he wants. So when Wilson goes over and negotiates the Treaty of Versailles, he brings back the treaty, and it now has to be approved by Congress, and it gets past the House, but it does not get past the Senate. The Senate absolutely refuses to ratify the Versailles Treaty on the pretext that they literally, in 1919, as this is trying to get passed, there are senators at the time who make speeches in effect to, this is a flawed peace, it is going to result in another war. And so the handwriting was on the wall from the very get-go that this was not going to result in a long-lasting peace, and it's the exact reason that the United States fails to ratify the Versailles Treaty, which again results in the United States isolating themselves isolating themselves for another 2 full decades after the war until World War II starts, because we didn't want to have any part in another European conflict. The League was born as a mere shadow of what it had originally intended to achieve, and this is in large part due to the fact that France really was very interested in punishing Germany for their role in escalating the conflict. So the impact of the war on society, we see dissent, which is people not happy, people being upset, increasing as the war continues. The Tsar in Russia, as I said, was overthrown by the provisional government, which at the time was known as the Duma, who was then overthrown by the Bolshevik Communist Revolution. The Irish Republicans staged an insurrection in the Easter Rebellion in England, which we talked about before school even let out. In Germany, militant socialists and anti-war activists Rosa Luxemburg and Clara Zetkin were imprisoned for trying to convince fellow socialists not to support the war effort. Large crowds of women in France, Austria, and Italy protested working conditions and high prices of things. And then government censorship existed in virtually every country, and people increasingly grew dissatisfied with the integrity of their governments and the role of dictatorship that was imposed upon them. The end to long-standing royal dynasties, as I said, look at this. With World War I is a major turning point in European global politics, because we see the end of the Habsburg dynasty. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire comes to an end. The Romanov dynasty, which had been in place for 300 years, is removed. They get taken out of power, and Russia gets turned into a communist nation, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Hohenzollern dynasty, the Prussian dynasty, removed in Germany, which had lasted 300 years. The German Empire is done. The Russian Empire is done. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is done. The Ottoman Empire is completely destroyed, which had been around for 500 or more years. So this is a major geopolitical turning point. And then, of course, the entire map of Europe gets redrawn too, thanks to the notion of self-determination, meaning that different nationalities ought to be able to run their own state affairs and not be influenced by nationalities of others. So this is not going to end nationalism. In some sense, it's going to only be the beginning. So we see the creation of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then a pan-Slavic state in the Balkans known as Yugoslavia, which is not there anymore, as Yugoslavia itself in the 1990s went through a period of time where they became completely fragmented and then were turned into sovereign states. So now we don't have a pan-Slavic state in the Balkans. We have a number of different states down there, such as Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Albania, etc., so Slovenia and so on. All of those states become sovereign nations more or less in the 1990s. Germany split in two by the Polish corridor. One of the biggest problems with the Treaty of Versailles, in Germany's view, was that their lands get literally bisected, so that Poland, which was a brand new state again, which had been taken over, you remember, in the partitions of Poland in the late 1700s, Poland had not had sovereignty for a very long time. So when they create this Polish state, which was carved out of the lands of both Germany and Russia, what they did was they didn't want to make Poland landlocked, and so they carved this little swath of land out through German territories up to the Baltic Sea, not the Balkans, the Baltic up in the north. And I'll show you a map of what that looks like in just a second here. So this is whoa, there we go. This is Germany before World War I, and as you can see here, Germany has a considerable amount of land that at the time made it so that its border butted up right against Russia here. Nowadays, the German or the European map doesn't look anything like this. This was what would have been Poland, but remember, a lot of Polish territories have been taken over by Prussia and Austria and Russia during the partitions of Poland. So this is kind of where you're going to see Poland form as a state right in this region right here. Austria-Hungary is completely broken apart after the war. You're going to see some significant territorial changes in this region here, as well as down in the Balkans too. So let's take a look at kind of how the map changes, and I'll go back and forth a few times so you can see Denmark here. Look at how tiny Denmark is. They're going to give this entire region back to Denmark up in that area there. So let's take a look here. All right, you can see it's not perfect. Okay, it's not perfectly placed over one another, but it's as close as I could get it using two separate images, slide to slide. Gosh, this thing, I'm going to have to use the arrow. This is so much easier. Okay, so let's go back and forth here. Take a look at Germany. Here's Germany afterwards. You can see now Poland is this massive state and now Poland doesn't even look like this anymore because a lot of these regions have since been returned to Russia. But this is where they carve that swath of land so that Poland doesn't get landlocked. Otherwise, if they had stopped the border here and allowed this region to stay in Germany, Poland would have been completely landlocked. They would have relied on German trade or Russian trade or even trade from others to be able to supply themselves. And the European powers at the treaty or at the Paris Peace Conference at the Palace of Versailles did not want Poland to be landlocked. So what they did was they literally carved this little swath of land out of Germany here and give it over to Poland. And this is an abomination to the German people, particularly to Hitler down the line. This is seen as just an absolute atrocity that they would cut German lands away from German people in the name of self-determination just to give it over to Poland, which Germany didn't even believe should be a state in the first place. As you can see here too, there was a lot of land that was returned to Czechoslovakia. Look at what happened to the whole Austro-Hungary. There wasn't even a Czechoslovakian state before. All of this had been controlled by Austria-Hungary previous to the start of the war. So now we have Czechoslovakia, we have Austria, we have Hungary, we have Romania down over here. We have Yugoslavia, which is that pan-Slavic state. Albania was created as a sovereign state, so they were their own state prior to the war, and they were a state after the war. But as for the rest of these areas, Serbia in this region here, all the way up to Slovenia in this region over here, were created into a pan-Slavic state where all Slavic folks were more or less united into a single state. And the guy that's made the leader of Yugoslavia is a guy named Josip Josep Tito, Tito. He was a communist, and Josip Tito runs Yugoslavia for a very, very long time. He wasn't the leader right away, but he is the longest standing communist leader in Yugoslavia, and he was able to uniquely carve a path for Yugoslavia to remain rather independent from the Soviet Union over here during the Cold War. But Yugoslavia, as I said, in the 1990s, they start to fragment and break apart into individual states again. So now we see Serbia and Bosnia and Croatia and various other places in the Balkan regions as sovereign states in modern day times. Italy does get some of their lands back, although not as much as they had wished they did. Austria's lands are severely restricted, but it's really these regions in here. Germany, if you go back here, remember that this region here, Alsace-Lorraine, had belonged to Germany for a period of time after the Franco-Prussian War. Afterwards, that land is returned to France and is still in France's possession today. The Saar coal mines are right in this region here. And by the way, this entire region west of the Rhine River, this is a very big river in Germany. It's a hugely important river for commerce and trade, and this entire region here was to be demilitarized. In other words, the German military, which was already limited from the Treaty of Versailles in its size, was not allowed to enter into this region here, and they don't enter into that region until Hitler allows for the German military to enter into this region as part of his ramping up of militarism in the years prior to World War II. So that happens in about 1936. Okay. The Russian Revolution resulted in the world's creation of the world's first communist nation. German nationalist resentment of harsh Versailles Treaty doomed the new Weimar Republic. That was one of the other things, was that they instituted a brand new democratic-style government in Germany, which, if we're being honest, Germany, although they had had political parties during the age of mass politic, they were still very, very, very conservative and very, very, very autocratic, in the sense that really the buck stopped with the emperor, which was Kaiser Wilhelm II during World War One. And this Weimar Republic is this baby bird democracy that is going to have a really, really hard time taking its first flight out of the nest, to use a little bit of a bird metaphor there. The Weimar Republic, Germany just does not have a strong history of democracy, and the Weimar Republic was like trying to take the training wheels off a little bit too soon. The Weimar Republic very, very quickly, for having agreed to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, for not having any ability not to agree to those terms, they couldn't resist, gets blamed by more nationalist, hardcore, right conservatives in Germany as stabbing Germany in the back. So a lot of times they will refer to the Treaty of Versailles and the Weimar Republic as the stab in the back to the Germans. So there's a lot of anger with this treaty, which was, of course, partially responsible for why nationalism doesn't get vanquished in Germany, is because all these guys who were so angry about the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, whereas they would have, in a normal situation, been discredited after the war as having failed and having created such an amount of chaos, they managed to retain some degree of dignity because of the degree of resentment and anger from the German people for having to settle, for the Weimar Republic settling with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which were so restrictive and harsh on Germany. The shift in financial power to the United States also starts to take place here. Europe, by this point, has really lost its 500-year-long domination of global economics, and the United States increasingly becomes the world's leading creditor, the world's greatest producer, due to the complete drain of Europe's resources during World War I, and also, too, of course, the devastation to the not just the economies, but the German countryside and the European countryside, and the degree to which Europe will now need to be rebuilt that the war is over. And really, a lot of these unresolved political and economic differences directly lead over time as long-term causes to World War II. One of the major economic thinkers that is probably the most significant economic thinker since Adam Smith released The Wealth of Nations in 1776 was John Maynard Keynes, and he wrote a piece in 1919 called The Economic Consequences of Peace, where he basically predicted that the harsh terms of this treaty would hurt Germany's economy in the long term, and thus the economy of the rest of Europe. And basically, John Maynard Keynes' idea is that unbridled free market capitalism would result in problems over time, and that it was the responsibility of nations to support economies to the extent that they allowed things to remain competitive and stuff. So it's an alteration of free market capitalism to basically say, like, look, if we don't put in some regulations, if governments don't take some degree of control over the economy, we're going to see a real destitute situation develop, particularly with respect to Germany. So when Hitler took control of Germany in 1933 and began its aggressive policies, Keynes' predictions from several years back seemed rather prophetic and really rather intelligent. And of course, this is going to wrap things up for us today, but I don't know if you recognize the guy on the left there, but that is Adolf Hitler, who served in World War I as a low-ranking corporal in the German military. So Hitler served in World War I. He gets out based on, I think, an injury of some sort. He is not killed in the war, obviously. This is another image of him with some of his German comrades, and him on the right over on this side. So this is Hitler as a young man when he was serving in Germany. And of course, his service in the military led him to become the extreme nationalist that he was. So that brings us to the conclusion of today's online instruction. About an hour and a half long lecture here today. I hope that this was informative for you. We are now done with World War I. I will be assigning something, I don't know what it is yet, I have to create it, to you guys by around noon today or so. And thank you so much for tuning in this morning. Have a great day.